it's an incredible pleasure to be here. Budapest is beautiful, even though it's a little bit colder than London today. Sorry, guys. I'm also really happy to be here at CMDS because I feel like the Center for Media, Data and Society here at the CEU is a kind of fellow traveler among some of the, certainly in relation to some of the things that I've been thinking about, but also in relation to some of the things that we have been building in the Department of Media and Communications at the LSE. So we have just launched a master's program in data and society, which is an interesting kind of complement to the approach of our colleagues here at CMDS. So I hope we have lots of fruitful exchanges across these two developments. Today I want to talk about mediating data, citizenship, and the city. And I want to make an argument for why we should think about data in relation to media, and also why the city in particular is a good place to think about and reconceptualize the idea of citizenship in relation to data. Cities are places where lots of data is produced, but cities are also places where different kinds of citizenship are produced than perhaps we think about when we think about citizenship in a national citizen context. So I have to do this awkward thing here where I'm going to lean over and hopefully I'll lean over and this will work correctly. Look at that. Okay, so here are the questions that we're going to talk about today. Let me do this. First of all, I want to talk about how I think about what is a data city. But then I also want to talk about how we think about cities in general. So who makes the city, and what is citizenship? And in a data city, one of the things that I will explain is that one of the key roles for constructing power in a data city are intermediaries who are able to broker data-fied relationships between individuals and collectives and between citizens and their governments. And so these brokers have a kind of power that we haven't seen before. So we're going to look at these kinds of who are these brokers. And it doesn't matter whether the brokers are public entities, private entities, or civic entities. And so we'll ask a couple of questions about these kinds of intermediary relationships. And one of the other features of a data city is that it's interested in calculation. Value is created through calculating data. This is a really different way of thinking about media. It's a different way of thinking about our power to communicate and what in fact we are communicating. So if we're communicating a lot of information, if our communication capacity is built out of information, then it makes a difference that it's calculated, how it's calculated, and by whom it's calculated. So I think that's another question. And the final question, because I'm a social scientist but also somebody who's interested in action in the world, is why does it matter? So I'll finish on that question. So the first question is, what is a data city? And I think where I'm going to talk about sort of three aspects to a data city. The notion of a data city being based on a kind of computational paradigm for what a city is. The notion that intermediaries within this city, the people who are kind of making these agreements and doing this brokerage between people who create data and people who use data, are data-based. So these are data-based intermediaries. And perhaps also where we will look at who these intermediaries normally are and the rise of public-private partnerships in providing all kinds of civic services, but increasingly in providing civic services and intermediations in this data-related space. So the first thing to think about is how computational paradigms have come to shape the way we think about the city. And this is I like this diagram. This diagram is quite old. This is a 10-year-old diagram, which was one of the initial sketches of how an Internet of Things would work. By an intermediary called, at the time, it was called Patchbay, and now it's called Xively, and we'll get back to Xively a little later. Xively is an operator of a data platform where you can manage data that's collected from various different sensors or different data collecting objects that are interconnected together. And what I like about this image is that it represents the number of different kinds of things that you might want to compute in order to make meaning. So if we're thinking about the data city and the idea of a data city as being a place where people do different kinds of communication that is computational, this is a good way of starting to think about this. So we have things like our house, our office, our pollution sensor, our laptop, our web page, our visualization equipment, and our interactive installation. And all of these entities are data creating entities that Patchbase says, why don't you send all of that information to one place and we will bring it together and compute it in order for you to make meaning out of how all of these things are related. And this kind of computational paradigm for not just linking together all these various things that we do in our everyday lives that are kind of mediations, different kinds of mediations of who we are and what we do, but actually bringing them together to compute them is a paradigm shift. So we're shifting towards this idea that by bringing things together to compute them, that's how we're going to make meaning. And the sort of ultimate result of this computational paradigm for the city is the idea of the smart city, where the entire city is understood to be able to be managed and computed to deliver optimal services. And we'll get back to the smart city, but I just want to introduce the sort of framing of the sort of perfect application of the computational paradigm to the city is the idea of the smart city. And this is one of many very similar kinds of framings you can find of the smart city, the one-stop total solution provider, like the ultimate single point of computation of many diverse streams of data, which of course we all know are representations of experience. So we have, of course, cities have long histories of being augmented in various ways by technologies and having these kinds of paradigms of control over information that is produced within cities and information that's produced about citizens. And of course, I come from London, the world capital of closed-circuit television monitoring. So I am obliged to provide you with an image such as this, which is a very sort of typically London image. And this kind of history of augmentation tells us that the computational paradigm is not the only paradigm that's important. The other paradigm that's important is how is this information understood and who is going to be in control of it. So the surveillance paradigm is a kind of idea that, you know, we will collect lots of information about lots of people and put it in one place. The computational paradigm, the total solution smart city, does also imply that, but the computation itself doesn't imply that. The computation could be done in any number of places and in any number of ways. So it's the intersection of the computation paradigm with this kind of centralizing vision of control over what happens in a city that results in what I like to think of as the kind of top-down smart city. Because equally, we could have a bottom-up smart city. And there are lots of people who have theorized data cities and who have theorized the ways that people could possibly engage with producing data, but also calculating data, representing their own experience through data, representing different kinds of experiences with different kinds of data, as having oppositional interventions into this space of the smart city. And one of the people whose work is significant in this notion, in relation to this notion of the bottom-up smart city, is Anthony Townsend, who's an urbanist, who's written quite a lot about the notion of there being a lattice work of spaces and informational capacities that let people like write over their city. So you don't have to take the city as written. You don't have to take the city as described by the surveillance from above. You can create and annotate and augment your city from your own experience and based on your own experience. And when we get to this notion of, you know, the combination of this with this, we end up with this, which is the sort of perfect managerial top-down smart city. And it's in real contrast to this notion of the sort of bottom-up smart city. And this is where we get sort of paradigms around smartness and management of resources. And one of the things that you notice about these kinds of top-down smart cities is that the word smart implies efficiency and control. So we have smart water, smart energy, smart buildings, smart integration, and smart public services, and smart mobility. These are all optimized services that use data collection to improve the development of city services. And they depend on different kinds of They depend on different assumptions. And so I started collecting definitions of smart cities to sort of think about how the data city as viewed from above and from a kind of central control perspective might be presented. And so again, we have these kinds of lists of smartness. And I think this is a really interesting discourse, the sort of like, if we repeat smart often enough, the city will actually become smart. So the EU Smart Cities report from 2014 again repeats smartness. They have, apparently we are going to have smart people in our cities, which is good, which is something we didn't have in some of the kind of corporate led projects on smart cities. But we are also going to have smart economy and smart environment. So I started wondering to myself about what the smartness was about. And this second definition from the Copenhagen Clean Tech Cluster gives us some clues about what smartness might actually be and how smartness might be related to particular economic or political arrangements. So we have this idea that the technology and data gathering should be able to gather, analyze, and distribute data about the city to optimize efficiency and effectiveness in the pursuit of, it's Copenhagen, right? So you want both competitiveness and sustainability. Be able to communicate and share that data and information using common definitions and standards so it can be reused, and to be able to act multifunctionally, which means they should provide solutions to problems. So what I think is key about this, because you can also see that there are several different directions in which the idea of the smart city can be taken. It can be both competitive and sustainable, but underlying it is this real sense of efficiency and problem solving. And that means that you need some people or some entities to provide this problem solving and efficiency. And what the EU report from 2014 recommends is public-private partnerships. And they say they are highly important, especially where the private partners bring in developer expertise, finance, and technology capabilities. And they say also the involvement of citizens and users. So this is not only about bringing in certain types of partners, it is also about citizen participation. But the key things here, again, are this idea of problem solving and efficiency. And I think these things are very interesting in the context of the city because, of course, the city is still full of citizens. So this is just to get back to the beginning of this section where I showed that, that sort of diagram that I thought exemplified this logic of calculation. We have a kind of combination of the logic of calculation, an interest in centralized control, and also an interest in involving intermediaries who are not necessarily public entities, so public-private partnerships. And this is an updated vision of what the same company, which was called Patchbay, which is now called Zively, this is their marketing material from 2014. So they have now moved from this kind of let's develop the computational paradigm to being very clear about the fact that the Internet of Things is open for business. And I think this is absolutely fine, and I think there are lots of business opportunities in relation to the Internet of Things. But I also think it raises some interesting questions, particularly when we're thinking about cities, about what cities are and what do we want cities to become. Cities are places where people enact citizenship, where people develop their sense of being able to represent themselves, represent a culture or a subculture, and where people create lots and lots of data, which is not only able to be made efficiently valuable, but is also valuable because it is a form of communication that people are producing themselves. So I think things become a little bit more complicated. And I like this, this definition of the city. This is from my colleague Miria Giorgio, who writes quite a lot about cosmopolitan cities, cities where people come from all over the world and arrive in cities and mix together in cities. And she says the city is not only an experimental space, but also a political space where struggles for power, control, and ownership are reflected and shaped through the intense and mediated meetings of people, technologies, and places. And I think also that cities, because of these struggles for power that are mediated in this kind of intersection of people, technology, and place, because these are sort of places where power is struggled over, I think they're also places where citizenship has a looser and maybe a more productive kind of sense than citizenship has when we're thinking about it in the national context. So you could be in London, for example, I mean, the people who live in London are nationals of many countries. But they live in London, and they work in London, and they are involved in various ways in producing the culture of London. So in that sense, they have a cultural citizenship that is of their place, that is dependent on their involvement in a labor market in a particular location, their habitation in that particular location, their community relationships in that particular location. And this is the kind of everyday citizenship, a kind of vernacular citizenship, maybe even the kind of citizenship that we think of as being good citizenship. And I think it's a way in which we produce the city that is not only about efficient service delivery. And so when I think about the data city, I also think about ways that citizens produce data cities. And this project, these are photographs from a project called 596 Acres, which is in New York City. And it's a project where people very consciously are producing a community of practice that is at the intersection of this technology, place, and people. So 596 Acres looks for open government data related to the availability of vacant land in different areas of New York City, and connects this open data about the availability of vacant land and the ownership of over land that has not been developed to people in neighborhoods who are interested in knowing why there is a vacant lot in their neighborhood, and also who are interested in possibly doing something with the land. So they do a variety of different things. They make maps of where there are vacant lots across the boroughs of New York City. They do community gardening projects on land where ownership is in dispute to such an extent that the land is unlikely to be developed and is therefore de facto in public hands. And they also do lots of community decision making that is facilitated and supported by an IT, sort of networked IT infrastructure. So some of this is web-based, but also largely supported by people holding in-person meetings and telephoning elected representatives in order to follow up on the open data that is published on the web. So it's a really interesting intersection of a number of different ways that people get access to data, use data, connect data to places that they spend time, and also connect this to actions that they think of as being important in their own lives. And so this image is from a kind of model that dates from 2011 for a citizen-driven, the data citizen-driven city. This was a design competition run in 2011. And the proposals for the data-driven, data citizen-driven city imply that sort of a perfect data citizen individual goes about the city annotating. This is sort of like the bottom-up smart city that Anthony Townsend is inspired by as well. This sort of a notion of an individual citizen noting and creating and optimizing their city. And I find it a really compelling vision, but I also find it somehow less inspiring than the very messy kinds of processes that 596 acres employs. And so I'm very curious about this idea of opposing bottom-up and top-down smart cities. I'm wondering whether bottom-up smart cities need to have a different kind of notion of citizenship attached to them than the optimized problem-solving top-down smart city. Because as Adam Greenfield points out in the sort of bottom of these two quotations, the dominant paradigm of the sort of smart city holds that, he says, the world is in principle perfectly knowable, its contents innumerable, and their relationships capable of being meaningfully encoded in the state of a technical system without bias or distortion. It is effectively an argument that there is one and only one universal and transcendently correct solution to each identified individual or collective human need, and that this solution can be arrived at algorithmically via the operations of a technical system, and that this solution is something that can be encoded in public policy, again, without distortion. And this is also, in some ways, this kind of vision of the perfect data citizen-driven data city, where every citizen is just contributing truthful information about a real state of the world that you can really perceive with no distortion that isn't infected with the particular perspective of the particular individual. And in contrast to this, which is really quite messy and quite literally grassroots, it is a very technocratic, let's say, vision of an optimizable city. And it's one in which citizenship has a very particular kind of framework. So I wanted to talk about what is citizenship, and what is citizenship in the data city, in the kind of perfect optimized data city, and what is citizenship in the slightly messier, but still possibly data enhanced city. And I think that the key thing here is that there is a sort of tension between the notion of a citizen and the notion of a consumer in many of these visions of data cities, and certainly in the vision of smart cities. And I thought that was also worth thinking about. Because one of the realities of cities is that not only are they places where this idea of citizenship is rather loose, there are also places where, at least in the country that I live in, there are severe financial constraints on these kinds of, on the governments who are tasked with maintaining civic infrastructure. I don't know how, and cities are all different, and this is why cities also are very interesting places to examine. So Phil was telling me yesterday that many of the roads in this part of Budapest have had funding from the European Union to be repaired. And so this is the case in many cities as well. Cities have interconnecting levels of governance that might be sort of supranational, national, and local. But the fact is that many local governments feel that they have financial pressure that results from a kind of austerity mandate. And with this kind of pressure to save money, governments might shift from seeing citizens as those with civic responsibilities and engagements, these kind of engaged citizens that we saw in the 596 acres example, to classifying them as consumers who need to have their needs met efficiently, but who also purchase services from providers. And this is something that other scholars have noted. My colleague Sonia Livingstone, along with her co-authors, were writing about how the citizen and the consumer are merging in other areas of communications policy. And this is in relation to the communications regulator in the UK. So the regulator has preferred to align the terms citizen and consumer so that the interests of both may be met as far as possible through an economic agenda of market regulation. Among civil society groups, there's growing concern that the citizen interest is becoming marginalized as the consumer discourse becomes more widespread. So the response to this kind of ideology of austerity has been to kind of collapse the category of citizen into the category of consumer. And this, I think, also has very interesting consequences for thinking about what does it mean to be a citizen in that good citizen sense that I was saying. If you are in a city because you have chosen to be there and you feel like you want to participate in the life of the city, you would like perhaps to be able to enact something like your own voice. And so here's a definition of voice from Nick Couldry: the effective opportunity for people to speak and be heard on what affects their lives. And so far, we have seen lots of models for data cities in which this capacity for voice is somewhat limited. And I've become really interested in how people are able to effectively develop this kind of voice in relation to either control over their data, but also in terms of their ability to be understood as citizens with voice and not only as consumers. And one interesting example that is again from my sort of local context comes from a huge citizen resistance to a recent data-related project, which was the CareDot data, large-scale government database of all health-related information. And this is in principle a really, really good idea because we have a very decentralized medical system in the UK. It's also entirely state-funded and free at the point of use. So that means when I go to my local doctor, they have one set of records which doesn't necessarily travel with me to the hospital unless I physically take it. So this proposal was to create a very, very large-scale database of all health information of all UK patients of the National Health Service, which sounds really great, except for two problems. You couldn't, you had to opt out, so by default, everybody would have been enrolled in this. So and to opt out was actually was quite difficult. You had to go and request a special form and post it to a special place. And the other problem was that not only was this database going to be accessible to all kinds of medical practitioners, it was also going to be accessible to the health insurance industry, which is a sort of interesting choice, let's say, in a country with socially supported healthcare. And there was an incredible citizen backlash against this particular project. And I was starting to think about this as a sort of point at which people enact their civic responsibility to ask for better governance of their data. They did not want this, but people did not want this to be poorly governed. And Ben Goldacre is a physician and an advocate in the UK, and he wrote, they did not want arrogant paternalism, boasts about commercial profits, a lack of clear governance, and a failure to communicate basic science. So this downfall parody video was one of many sort of memes and discussions and sort of internet and non-internet based responses to this. So clearly people do have a civic interest in their data in relation to their voice and in relation to their citizenship. But what we have now is a situation where this drive towards efficiency and problem solving and this introduction of different kinds of intermediaries into the smart city is beginning to create a system in which it becomes more difficult to exercise this voice. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about brokerage and information intermediaries. And I wanted to start out by saying in many cities there are already large-scale intermediaries who provide public services. And so one of them is Veolia. Veolia is a water company. This is a sort of beautiful design that they have on their corporate homepage. And Veolia is involved in lots of smart city projects. And in many of these projects, Veolia is the designer of water infrastructure, also the designer of water meters, and also the entity that is responsible for data about individual water use. And water, of course, is absolutely essential for human life. You might argue that access to water, since it's essential for human life, should be something that is provided equally to all. And you might wonder about what happens when you have a company one of whose interests is in returning shareholder value, controlling not only access to water, but all information about use of water and all of the infrastructure that connects that information about water with the actual delivery of water. This raises some very, very interesting questions about data, about basic resources for human life, and also about citizenship, because once upon a time, the idea of providing clean and safe water to everyone was a collective responsibility. And so the increasing rise and prevalence of these intermediaries does change the way that we think about these kinds of resources. Another example that is more closely connected to data, and is maybe a little bit blurrier, is this is Urban Engines. That is it's a startup that does this kind of information intermediation and public-private brokerage at a different kind of level than Veolia. They're not delivering basic infrastructure, but they're doing something that's very, very interesting in terms of citizenship and data. Urban Engines takes data, often open data, from transport authorities in the cities where it operates, and takes that information and offers individuals the possibility to optimize their commute routes to work. So let's say I want to take the train to work, but I live in a really busy and congested city, and so I have to either take 2 trains, or possibly if the second train is late or that line is broken, I could take the bus. So Urban Engines takes all of the sort of aggregate data from the transport authority, and then offers the individual person the ability to optimize their trip to work. So if I have the app, when I leave my house, it will say, I have, the information says that the Piccadilly line is down, so you better take the bus for the second half of your trip because that'll get you there 20 minutes earlier. Great, you save 20 minutes. And then, of course, the app also collects the information about where I'm going, because there's GPS in my mobile device, and because I'm sharing that information with Urban Engines, or with, this is one example of many of these kinds of companies. And then Urban Engines, or whatever the other company is, collects enough information about enough people taking enough trips that they can then sell that back to the transport authority. And it's a very, very nice business model, but it's a very, very powerful one as well. And this is what Yevgeny Morozov wrote about the same business model as it's applied to the transport information that Uber collects from all of its trips. And I mean, I don't know if people know how much information Uber collects, but it is the amount of information collected from each person who's using the Uber app is far beyond what the minimum that you would require to actually operate the app. It's, calls back multiple times a day to the home company, transmits all kinds of geopositioning information, tracks how many packets are sent through the phone, many things. We can talk about that later. But what Morozov has identified is that Uber is effective because it controls all of the key data points. Phones tell it all it ever needs to know about planning a trip. And so he wonders, what would happen if that data went back to the city government? What would happen if that data were governed by an institution that is responsible for collective provision of services? There is all kinds of data in cities that is being collected and hence made valuable by these intermediaries that I've just explained. And he says, cities have undoubtedly under pressure seem to have grasped the importance of mounting a response to Uber's assault, but they really haven't managed to understand how you could mount this assault by thinking about different ways of governing data. So I think this is a real gap. We now have a kind of situation in which there are various forces that I've explained that have combined to create this sort of space in which a company can intermediate and gain huge value by gathering information about individual citizens and also by employing data that's collected by governments. Whose responsibility is that data? And is it important enough that perhaps governments might wish to themselves govern this data instead of contracting it out to public-private partnerships. So I'm just going to finish with a couple of examples of different ways that, citizens have gathered data and represented data sort of as a counterpose, to kind of counterpose this narrative. And I'll just give a couple of different examples of civic brokers of data. And one of them is Transparent Chennai, which is a mapping project in Chennai in India. And Transparent Chennai makes maps of slums, and they make maps of assets that are located within slums. And the idea of mapping the assets in slums is for people who live in slums to actually have their infrastructure recognized by the city government, that this kind of data already exists. And Transparent Chennai is in some ways doing the same kind of brokerage work as we have been discussing here. They're collecting information and representing information about the people who live in a city whose information has never been represented and who therefore have never been able to be deemed worth providing civic services to and providing it to the government. So it's not only a public-private intermediary that's possible, but there are other kinds of intermediaries. And the sort of second one that I want to mention, although I don't have a slide for this, is there have been a number of transport mapping applications that have come from civil society organizations. So sort of in counterpoint to the Urban Engines startup application, there's a recent application that was developed by Cycle Streets, which is a cycling mapping project in London that allows people in one of the London boroughs to essentially map their own cycle journeys in order to sort of send that information back to the city government and have the government invest in better cycling infrastructure as a result. We're still in the calculation paradigm here. We're still in, I better quantify it, I better make it mapped, I better make it visible, and we're still in a sort of state in which what gets calculated is quantifiable and often financially valuable, or financially valuable both in terms of being able to be bought and sold, and possibly by two different markets in the Urban Engines example, or valuable in terms of cost reduction, as in the Cycle Streets, cyclists mapping their own routes and identifying the problems for the council. This removes the council's necessity to actually send out an expert to survey what's happening with the cycle infrastructure and outsources this to the citizens. So there are some really interesting tensions still about what gets calculated, and also what the consequences and unintended consequences of this kind of collection and quantification of value are. And I'll just give a couple of quick examples here. One of the reasons I put up these maps with no context is I find maps, like we assume that information visualizations make things clearer for us. But actually they don't. And one of the things I think aesthetically that's interesting about lots of these images is that they are very abstract. The top one is a map of San Francisco, and it's a map generated by a real estate agency that maps information about different places where you might want to buy a house. And that's quantifiable information about the demographics of a particular area, the crime statistics, and what's interesting here is that it's very clear for what purpose this brokerage is happening. For what purpose would you make a map of this area in this way? Well, it's because the real estate agent serves to benefit from having transactions that are higher value, and so therefore has an interest perhaps in mapping things in a particular way to highlight values of certain neighborhoods where houses might be likely to sell for more, and perhaps mapping different attributes onto areas that where houses are likely to sell for less. And this is connected to the sort of idea of redlining in cities, where some neighborhoods in cities get redlined. They have fewer services. They have worse infrastructure. They have lower prices. And these kinds of datafied intermediaries can also contribute to these processes. The bottom map, and this is just a quick anecdote about kind of consequences of quantification. This is an overall screenshot of a crime map of London produced by the Met Police. The Met Police first produced their crime map in, I think it was 2011. And they produced very, very detailed crime maps. You could map them down to the street level. What was the absolute first thing that everybody did? Let's go and see if there were ever any crimes on my street. Which is, I mean, both very interesting, perhaps, for you, but it's also very interesting not just for you as a person who wants to avoid crime, but it might also be very interesting for somebody who wants to commit crime, because it shows where was a really, really good place to commit a certain kind of crime. So this is also the kind of interesting unintended consequences and unintended valuations of information that gets quantified and then represented. There are some interesting ways of playing with this. This is a really neat project from 2003 called IC, which is a very rudimentary map, but this is a rudimentary map of all of the surveillance cameras in Lower Manhattan as of 2003, so that if you wanted to walk through Manhattan without being surveilled, you could conceivably do it with the help of this map. And I think this is a sort of it's an interesting surveillance datafication project. And then finally, here's another one, which is called Networks of Dispossession, which is an art project that actually tries to map and datafy the ways that citizenship and cities intersect by mapping the power relationships between the decision makers who are in charge of urban renewal in Istanbul. So these are networks of people who are represented in terms of their relative possession of social capital, cultural capital, or financial capital. And the ways that their relationships can be mapped also tell you something about the ways that decisions about the physical shape of Istanbul might be enacted. And I just was leaving these as more, these are really, this is a very interesting case in terms of this idea of data and citizenship. Because this is not only about the physical place and about representing physical places, but it's also about representing relationships between people in, that has impacts for places. And I think these are very interesting examples because they talk about, they show us that the logic of calculation is not total, right? It's not that there is some sense in which once you have a calculative paradigm, you will always have centralized control. It's not that once you have a calculative paradigm, you will always have a public-private partnership for your service delivery. There are lots of other things that this calculative paradigm might imply. And so I think this matters quite a lot, and it matters because I think there are three things that are shifting here. There are clearly some shifts in the ways that we can conceive of citizenship. The sort of most obvious one is the collapse of the concept of citizenship into the sort of notion of a consumer of services. But there are also expansions of citizenship that are kind of made possible by the possibility of calculating things in different ways and from different perspectives. And we possibly also have some shifts in public and social responsibility. And we also might want to think about how all of this has impacts for the sustainability of the places that we live in. And as we know that the world population is increasingly urbanized, the likelihood of all of us spending the rest of our lives in cities is very, very high. So what kind of cities do we want to live in? So I'll leave you with this image of one of my favorite cities. This is from Paris. And it's also a good example of enacting of sort of citizenship, artistic citizenship or oppositional citizenship in terms of creating this graffiti on these walls. And a quotation from Howard Zinn, one of my favorite activists of all time, who says, it is impossible to be neutral in a world already moving in certain directions, where wealth and power are already distributed in certain ways. Neutrality means accepting the way things are now. So let us not be neutral. Let us be radical. Thank you.